Hello again all. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Mulqueen, and I am Switchboard's Administrative and IT Coordinator. To start, I want to inform you that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Switchboard website in the coming days. Thank you again for joining today's training on demystifying strengths-based services to foster refugees' resilience. This training is presented by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. Funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Switchboard is implemented by the IRC. The IRC has partnered with LIRS to provide employment-related training and technical assistance. I'd like to ask that if you're participating in this training with more than one colleague, but using a single computer, that you please type your names and organization into the chat box so we know who is joining us. Before we dive into the content, I'll briefly mention some logistics in WebEx. If you are using phone audio today, you can click the icon in the upper left corner at any time to find the dial-in number and code. If you don't see this icon, click anywhere on the main webinar screen and it will appear. We welcome your comments and questions throughout today's session. Click the chat bubble icon in the bottom center of your screen to open chat and type a response or question. Send your message to all participants so that we can all view your comment. Again, if you don't see the icon tray at the bottom of your screen, click anywhere on the main webinar screen and it will appear. Lastly, during Q&A, you can click the small hand icon at the bottom right to raise your hand so that we can unmute your line. You can also type your questions, of course, if you're not comfortable speaking to the whole group. Again, my name is Rebecca Mulqueen, and now I'm going to be handing the presentation over to Dr. Julie Tippens to introduce herself along with today's co-presenters. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. I'm really excited about this topic. So my name is Julie Tippens. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Child, Youth, and Family Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My training is in public health and medical anthropology, so most of my work with refugees focuses on health-related research and interventions. For the past 15 years, I've worked both as a practitioner and researcher in the area of refugee health in the United States, as well as with camp-based and urban refugees in Kenya and Tanzania. So in my role as an assistant professor, I work with stakeholders in the community to identify resources, strengthen community academic ties, and explore strategies to improve refugees' health and well-being. I sit on a couple of different coalitions in Nebraska, Kenya, and Tanzania to make sure that the research that I'm doing has practical implications. And my ongoing work focuses on health, well-being, and resilience in the US, Kenya, and Tanzania. So, of course, I'm very excited about today's topic. I'm going to let Peggy and Mahad introduce themselves, and then we can proceed with the webinar.
Hello, we're happy to join you from Portland, Oregon. My name is Peggy Fulda. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Pennsylvania as well as in Portland, Oregon, where I am currently serving as the lead clinician in our refugee mental health program, serving primarily refugee immigrant clientele as well as some mainstream folks as well. In addition, I'm the clinical supervisor for our culturally specific certified peer specialist, which we'll talk a little bit about. I have background in clinical social work as well as global public health and was previously a case manager in Philadelphia. And I'm going to let Mahad introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mahad Hassan. I am a certified peer support specialist at Lutheran Community Services Northwest. I also help lead the peer support training program. I was born in Somalia, but spent a large part of my life in northern Kenya. Have been in the U.S. for the past 19 years. My work with refugees also has me working not only in terms of a program work with the peer support training program, but also providing direct services to refugees who are dealing with emotional health issues. I provide case management and peer support services. I've been doing this type of work for the past 4 years in different capacities, and I really enjoy the idea of peer support because it inherently models all the strength-based approaches that we have.
Okay, thank you both so much for introducing yourselves. So our objectives for today include being able to identify key concepts related to Oh, sorry, I thought somebody said something related to strengths-based service delivery and resilience, recognizing individual, family, community, and cultural strengths and assets in the refugee resettlement context, describing a peer support model and how this can be used to promote resilience and well-being, and then name a couple of different evidence-informed strategies that you can use to build on the strengths of clients and communities. In order to meet the listed objectives, I'm going to first provide an overview of the strengths-based approach, as well as some different evidence-informed strategies that use strengths-based practices with refugee individuals, families, and communities. Then I'm going to turn this over to Peggy and Mahad, who will provide an overview of an evidence-informed, culturally specific peer support program, as well as discuss some of the strengths-based strategies that they use in their own case management work. We'll be sure to leave some time for questions and comments toward the end of the webinar.
Okay, so at this point in the webinar, on the bottom right of your screen, you should see a poll question that is now open. Feel free to select your response to the question, and I will keep it open for 20 seconds. There's about another 10 seconds left to respond to the poll. Okay, so the poll is now closed, and I will share the results now. Julie, are you able to see the poll results?
I am, yes, thank you. Okay, so everybody falls, or most people are falling into, oh, okay, so I see. So not everybody responded, but that's great. So hopefully we will we'll have a little bit of something for everyone, and that some of these strategies are general enough that, that you'll all be able to use them in your work in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to start the webinar by providing an overview of what we mean when we talk about a strengths-based approach, and then why resilience is an important concept when working with people with refugee backgrounds. So I wanted to start by using Dr. Venkat Pulla's quote, which is a perfect introduction to strengths-based services. He defines strengths-based practice as really promoting resilience instead of focusing on deficits. And the emphasis here is that the strengths-based approach isn't really a set of skills or a set of strategies, but it's really a framing that we use in our work, and we can enhance this with some different skills and strategies that we'll present today. So Dr. Pulla also identified 5 foundations on which to build a strengths-based approach. The first is that we acknowledge that all people have strengths as well as the capacity for resilience. This might look a little bit different for different people, so really the main job here is to listen to what people are saying and listen for strengths and the ways that people are coping with different challenges in their lives. The second one is that people can change, and that people change and grow through their strengths, so that you really want to help people blossom by focusing on some of the positive aspects and really helping people identify, oh, you did a great job on this, or helping them identify ways that they overcame challenges, because this isn't always easy for us to see. It's a lot easier for us to see. I speak to myself also, that sometimes we notice our deficits a little bit more than our strengths. But if we focus on clients' deficits, that might unintentionally make them feel a little bit small or shrink in. And really what we want to do is have people grow through their strengths. As I said, it's hard to see some of our strengths anyway, and some of the different challenges that refugee individuals have been through might make it hard for them to see their different strengths in the context of resettlement. So it's the role of people working in refugee services to help people identify these strengths and then point these out when possible. And then finally, the fifth and final foundation for this is that all people have the expertise to address challenges they are facing as individuals, as families, and as communities. I do want to offer just a really quick word of caution that while we always want to start from a place of acknowledging strengths and not deficits, there could be times that require specific interventions that are needed and require referrals. So an example of that might be when a client is experiencing extreme distress that doesn't seem to be resolving over a period of time. A way to notice this I've found in my own work and research is when people might be accessing or utilizing formal services, such from refugee resettlement agencies beyond the initial resettlement period, and don't seem to be fitting into the community as much. This might mean that they're so distressed they've actually burned out their community resources. So that's a way to notice that. But also your peer supporters, peer support specialists, community leaders, other people in your networks are going to be able to help identify these individuals. Okay, and why do we want to use a strengths-based approach? The first reason is that a strengths-based approach helps people work with clients to identify their preferred supports and then to help strengthen these preferred networks within the community. It's also a way to improve the provider-client relationship and to build trust. It's a way to help clients recognize their strengths and unique cultural assets. So evidence tells us that sometimes new refugees might feel embarrassed by their differences or feel ashamed by their inability to communicate because of different languages, a different style of dress. So celebrating these strengths actually helps people in the long term beyond the shorter term resettlement period. Ethnic community-based organizations are a really excellent resource in many communities to help connect people to their cultures and to celebrate these. And finally, a huge part of the strengths-based approach is working with clients to identify goals that are really meaningful to them, and then helping them figure out this path and what stepping stones might be needed here. Okay, so in your own work with clients, before we move any further, we'd love to know what reason it has been useful to you to focus on strengths rather than deficits. So if you could take a moment.
Feel free to type your response in the chat window, and I will read them out for Julie.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any. Oh, we did get a response. Summer wrote that it builds confidence among clients.
Nice.
We also have a response from Jen. People respond better to positivity than negativity.
Excellent.
We have a few other responses regarding empowering clients. It is very empowering for clients to be reminded of the strengths they have that they may not have identified as strengths. It encourages them to take action, results in better outcomes, helps identify natural supports. Refugee individuals don't always know what their strengths in the new culture are. It's important to acknowledge them. And Jesse wrote, it is useful for pushing youth programs to succeed.
Oh, great. Okay, so it sounds like people are already working a lot with client strengths, and this is fantastic. So, so hopefully this is a bit of a refresher, and it sounds like you're all doing a lot of this work already. Okay, so during the registration questions, a few different people asked about how to conduct a strengths-based interview or about specific strategies or ways to include strengths-based approaches into existing work. And I wanted to return to some of Pula's work. I really enjoy reading everything that he's written, so he's a great resource. But he talks about 3 different questions to help facilitate a strengths-based approach with clients in different contexts. And what I want to point out is that this can be something for people who work with individuals, or if you're working as a family case manager, or if you're even working on community outreach, these apply to various contexts. So the first question is, what has worked for you before? And this is strengths-based because it acknowledges that individuals with refugee backgrounds have already overcome tremendous obstacles to get where they are, and that they really inherently possess the capacity for resilience in different situations. The second one is asking what does not work for you. So all of us have different ways of coping and succeeding that fit our personalities, our cultural expectations and values, and our approaches to interacting with others. So what works well for one person or even a particular community might not work the same way for a different person. And knowing what does not work is as important as knowing what does work for people. And it also shows a respect for people's perspectives and for their different experiences. And then the final question is what might work for you in the present situation? And this is a way to work together with clients to identify solutions to problems and not to solve the problems for people. So it's a way, instead of saying, here's what you should do, of acknowledging people's inherent strengths and their own creativity. Okay, now I'm going to move to cover resilience, and in this subsection, we will define resilience and then present what we know about resilience in refugee populations from a really burgeoning literature in this area. Resilience refers to how people overcome adversity, how they adapt, navigate, and negotiate resources for individual and collective well-being, and to how they create meaning out of their different experiences. Resilience is an important concept because it's linked to positive health and well-being, to the ability to cope with ongoing challenges, and to the individual and community capacity to withstand and address future shocks and challenges. So it helps people not just in the present, but to prepare for the future. I really love Dr. Carolyn Nordstrom's reference to what she calls world building, and that's a way to describe the resourcefulness, creativity, and tenacity needed to start a life in a new place. Another powerful description of resilience comes from Dr. Ann Maston, who refers to resilience as ordinary magic. She states that resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic of ordinary normative human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of individuals, in their families and their relationships, and in their communities. The implications of this are extraordinary, and I remember reading Dr. Maston's work for the first time, and it really transformed how I viewed resilience, not as something that only a few people experience, but that is actually is something that's quite common. And it really changed how I worked with and conducted research around people with refugee backgrounds. It also relates to this first foundation of a strengths-based approach, which is that all people have the capabilities needed to overcome adversity. So if we start from this perspective, it can be pretty transformative, I think, in our work. Okay, and another discussion question. So now that we've reviewed and defined resilience, we'd love to hear from you again. So what strengths, assets, or indicators of resilience have you observed in your own work with refugee clients and communities? And if you could take a moment to type your response in the chat.
Julie, we did get one response from Theo earlier while you were presenting that I thought I would read out while others are responding to the question. He said, reminding people of their deficits makes barriers seem even bigger and often leads to people wanting to rely on others to fix their problems. Reminding people of their strengths makes things seem manageable on the personal level.
Oh, that's a really great point. I love all of those, or many points wrapped into one. Thank you.
Sure, and now we're getting some responses to the question. Kathleen said, people we work with have survived many trials. Mm-hmm. Others are saying social capital and social bridging, having strong community ties. Nice. Jordan said, women's groups always show us how much strength and determination our clients have. Kathleen said, they are survivors, and have skills and resilience. Tracy had a great answer. She said their sense of humor, gratitude, and connectedness.
Yeah.
And Daniela wrote, the incredible will to accommodate new customs and cultures.
Oh, so these are all really great. So again, people are really already very attuned to the strengths of people they're working with, which is such an incredible starting point. So thank you. Okay, so now that we've heard from you, we'll talk a little bit about the literature on resilience. And we know that there are specific factors that help foster refugees' resilience in post-migration settings like the United States. So using a social ecologic model, which some of you might have seen before, as an approach to resilience, we can start to think about refugees' resilience as influenced by these various nested layers of context. So if you start at the bottom looking at the individual health outcomes and emotional health outcomes and really well-being and integration are influenced by the family and household unit, by the broader community, as well as by different cultural, political, and eco-social factors. So again, if we look at this, start from the bottom, proficiency in the host country language, faith, spirituality, and religion, and previous experiences are individual level factors that have been shown to help refugees cope with displacement and with starting life in a new place. Spirituality and faith help people make meaning of past and present struggles and situate themselves in current realities. Religion is a way to offer a way for people to practice faith, and it's also a way for people to connect with different supportive resources within religious communities. An implication for that might be that if you're working at a resettlement agency, really working with religious leaders and identifying religious institutions that might be able to help people, so mosques, temples, and churches in the communities. Religious leaders and spiritual leaders are often trusted mentors and advisors to people with refugee backgrounds, so that's another really important resource in the community. Oops, I'm sorry. I need to go back one. So we also know that family support is critical to refugees' well-being. This is especially important for older adults who experience isolation and a decline in social status in post-migration settings. Having a respected role within the household, so preserving culture through cooking, through storytelling, through providing advice to younger generations, are things that we know protect elders from poor emotional health outcomes and poor mental health outcomes. It's important to acknowledge these critical roles, as well as to help younger generations remember the value of elders and intergenerational relationships in their household. Intergenerational living has been shown to buffer against stress in some studies. At the community level, we know that friendship and peer support, especially from one's ethnic group, has been shown to help refugees adjust in post-migration settings. Often people from one's ethnic community or country of origin become what is known in the literature as fictive kin, or close friends who provide family-like support and who become family in a sense. So it's important to foster these supports while connecting individuals to various community resources. Organizational support, such as resettlement agency support, has been shown to be incredibly helpful, but some studies do note that refugees are sometimes confused by the short-term nature of support, and that can sometimes be viewed as betrayal, and it may foster resentment. So a way to address this is to work together with individuals and communities and families to identify different resources based on their specific goals. Ethnic community-based organizations, religious institutions, and so forth might help during that critical transition period. And I do want to point out that there is a great webinar and info guide on resource mapping in the Switchboard TA resources, so that would be a great resource for people to look at as well. And then finally, at this larger macro level, we know that policies that make refugees feel welcome and supported in their integration are definitely a positive. Respecting cultural and religious traditions and having spaces such as community centers or places of worship are invaluable and help refugees maintain dignity and ties to their culture while also adjusting to a new setting. Okay, and now that we've reviewed what we mean by a strengths-based approach, as well as some indicators of resilience, I wanted to follow this up with specific evidence-informed practices and strategies that you or your organization might be able to adapt.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Julie. I apologize to everyone for the first poll. I got a few messages that it wasn't open for long enough, so I'm going to open the second poll now, and I will leave it open for close to a minute just to give everyone plenty of time to input their answers. Okay, great. So far we have about 40 responses, so I'll leave it open for a little bit longer to give everybody an opportunity. Okay, so there's about 20 seconds left. And 10 more seconds. Okay, so I'm now going to share the results of the poll. Are you able to see them, Julie?
I am, yes, thank you. Okay, so it looks like there's a bit of a mix. So we have a little bit of everything. Most people saying often, so that's a really good indicator. Thank you. Okay, so I'm thinking that you might actually recognize that you are using strengths-based practices or services, but maybe without knowing this or recognizing it, because it's something of a term that's been tossed around lately. So hopefully you'll see yourself in some of these. But Green, McAllister, and Tart created an inventory to assess strengths-based service delivery in early childhood and family settings. And a lot of these approaches and strategies are applicable to refugee services. So I've taken 10 items, which also appear in the info guide as a list, and I frame them as strengths-based practices in the context of the diagram that we just looked at, so that social ecological model. I think when we review some of these practices, like I said, that you'll realize that you're already using a strengths-based approach for many people. So the first one is to be empowering, which is to focus on people's strengths. And that's, again, at this, they encompass the entire model. So focus on people's strengths, work with refugees and not for refugees. So a few of you identified that when responding to questions. To be humble about different cultures. So see culture as a source of strength. Research, again, shows that refugees sometimes feel a little bit of shame adjusting to a new place, so it's important to help them celebrate different cultures, their different value systems, ways of approaching life in the world, and see this as a source of pride. And then also working to identify goals. So identifying goals is a way to foster hope and optimism because it's a way to look toward the future. This is very important to well-being and refugees' mental health, and it's been shown to offset stressors in different situations. Working with clients to realize their goals through stepping stones is also a way to individualize different services. And then finally, no two individuals or communities are alike, so it's really important to culturally adapt and tailor services by asking people, is this working for you? What might work better while you're implementing different programs? Okay, and now we'll talk about some of these as they relate to the different layers, these nested layers of context. So if we again start at the bottom, focusing on the individual, resettlement agencies are often the first supports newcomer refugees receive. So it's important to do things like meeting people at the airport, which there are a couple of studies, very interestingly, that have been tied to that initial airport experience. And if people feel very welcomed at the airport, integration goes much more smoothly, or the resettlement process seems to go much more smoothly for them and their families. So, so that's something that's important, and I know is typically done, but to make that a really positive experience for people. Working with individuals and families, again, to identify goals, and then developing relationships in the community, so with religious leaders and institutions, ethnic community-based organizations, and so forth. At this next level of the family and the household, we want to be sure to build relationships with and among families. So focusing on families and what their naturally occurring sources of support are, or their preferred resources. Include families and services rather than focus on individuals when that's appropriate. And I know that that's not always appropriate, but if it is, that's a good practice. At the community level, when possible, we should develop relationships with others in the client's network. And then think about the different services and resources needed to help refugees adjust. So again, looking back at that community resource mapping webinar might be something that could be a strengths-based practice here. And then finally, at the cultural and political and eco-social level, remembering that communities have shared histories that started long before the process of even applying for resettlement in these other countries. So thinking about those, and sometimes we focus on those as they relate to challenges, but they are oftentimes also sources of strength. So now I'm going to review a couple of evidence-informed practices that use a strengths-based approach. First, I want to note that there are not yet best practices for working with clients, families, and communities with refugee backgrounds in the United States resettlement context. There are, however, promising practices or strategies and approaches that are backed by the literature. I also want to first acknowledge that all of you are experts in providing different services, and you know from your own experiences what works and does not work in real-world contexts. One of the challenges in identifying what we call best practices is the gap between practitioners and academics. So evidence to inform programming and policy largely comes from evaluations and systematic reviews that appear in scholarly journals. So one suggestion from me as an academic, that if you're working on programming that you see is really effective and that you really love and has had great program outcomes and great outcomes for the clients you're serving, you might want to find local faculty members and local researchers and think about how to publish this, and not for the sake of vanity, but because these help others tailor services. So, and it helps to contribute to the overall body of evidence. So you also have access to some specific strengths-based programming through Switchboard. So there have been recent webinars on youth mentoring, motivational interviewing, and resource mapping. My strategy then is going to be very broad and to highlight 3 cross-cutting strengths-based practices that have some promising evidence behind them, and that could also be adapted for a range of services. So that might be useful if you are working in health or mental health or employment or social services more generally. Specifically, I'm going to talk about group models, arts-based models, and community outreach and peer support models. So group models or group visit models are the practice of bringing together a small number of people to address a shared challenge or condition. So for example, I worked with medical researchers on a prenatal health program with Somali refugee women when I was a graduate student in Arizona. The group was based on the Centering Pregnancy model and was designed to increase access to health providers, to discuss health topics chosen by participants, and to improve pregnancy and birth outcomes. So we're just writing about this now, and hopefully that will be able to contribute to the evidence, because it had some really great outcomes for women and for their birth outcomes. Group models with refugees have focused on broad topics, including health, social and community integration, and employment. Addressing mental and psychosocial health in a group setting is often less threatening for many individuals who may face stigma going to traditional therapy. It also has incredibly positive results, including decreased depression and anxiety symptoms, enhanced social support from peers, and then overall improved quality of life. Participants in one study that focused on employment and integration had improved English language skills and the confidence needed to navigate their local environments, and they also had overall improved satisfaction with life in the United States at the end of the program. Group models reflect several strengths-based principles we reviewed. So these include focusing on problem solving within the community, capacity building to solve one's own problems, and enhancing social support and strengthening social networks outside of resettlement agencies and institutions. In terms of logistics, groups are shown to be most effective when they are facilitated or co-facilitated by peer support specialists or other lay health providers, because these are people who themselves are part of the community and can actually serve as cultural liaisons. It's important to focus on small groups, so about 5 to 12 people from what we've seen in the literature, And this is a way to give everybody time to talk and participate without feeling shy or overwhelmed. The literature also shows that groups with similar participants are the most effective, so people who share a language, or you might want to separate people by sex or gender so that women are together, men are together, that older adults are together, people with a shared medical condition or challenge, and so forth. And I would say that you really need to be sensitive. We all need to be sensitive to competing priorities such as work and caregiving responsibilities, because sometimes it's challenging to go to something extra or additional. There's a lot of great evidence behind group visit models, but there are still a few things that we don't know. So these include long-term outcomes because there have not been longitudinal studies conducted over time. We don't know a lot about cross-cultural groups, so I talked about groups within one culture or language group. Oftentimes that's a concern because of interpretation, but it could be that cross-cultural groups are also effective. We just don't know that yet. And we also don't know when it is most beneficial to start these groups. It might be something that's really helpful when people first arrive, or it could be something that completely overwhelms them. So if you know, we would love to hear from you if you've had different experiences, but it's not something that's reflected in the evidence at this time. And moving to arts-based models. So arts-based models are primarily used with children and youth and occasionally used with women, as shown in the literature. These include photography, drama and theater, drawing, painting, quilting, and so forth. They typically focus on overcoming trauma and improving mental health, as well as integrating into local schools and enhancing school-based performance. These are typically measured by mental health assessments and measured by grades and teachers' reports of behaviors. They've all had really exciting outcomes, including improved mental health and enhanced performance in school. They tie us to the strengths-based principles that we reviewed in terms of being culturally humble and learning from refugees' perspectives through their drawings and art. Some have also focused on building family strengths and relationships. So a particular study, which was an intervention focusing on developing children's coping skills, actually contained a segment during which children shared selected drawings with their parents and other family members. And the parents then reported having new insight into their children's experiences, and we're really grateful for that opportunity. An important consideration in this might be cost and training. So many arts-based models, especially those focused on improving mental and psychosocial health, use trained arts therapists. So when you're looking at different grants for programming, this is something to take into consideration. Unlike the previous group visit model, these groups have largely focused on children from different countries of origin and different cultures because they're oftentimes school-based. Before moving to the next slide on what we don't know, I want to offer a really quick word of caution that the positive benefits of arts-based therapy, specifically drama programming, and anything that takes children during school into a specific different setting are really specific to newcomer refugees, and they need to be further evaluated with people who have been here a little bit longer. A study in Canada, for example, showed that adolescent refugee and immigrant students who were raised in the host country actually felt really isolated when they were part of an arts-based intervention because they were pulled from classes with their Canadian peers. And it just really was something that brought out their differences when they were trying to fit in. So I think the practical takeaway from that is think about where students already are and focus on having that together if you are someone who works in school settings or is thinking of partnering with schools. So maybe focusing on students who are in an ELL class together, for example. It's also why it's important to evaluate different programs and see what works for whom and in what specific context. So even though there are really promising outcomes, there are still some things that we don't know. Again, we don't know when it's most beneficial, so what age group or what time of resettlement. If it makes others feel excluded from peers as well, that was found in one study, but it might not be across the board. And we don't really know the experiences of men and elders, if this is something that, first of all, if they would want to do or what the outcomes might be. Okay, and the last model, which is actually two separate but overlapping models, is community outreach and peer support. So they also overlap with group models, but they have a couple of different components that make them unique, and then I separated them out because of that. So these are typically used to promote health and well-being, things like health system navigation or taking people to doctor's appointments, filling out paperwork, doing home health assessments and community education, and so forth. There are studies that have focused on general integration, like navigating general resources, enhancing social support. They have very good results that include increased integration and improved health outcomes. These are strengths-based because they, first of all, center on communities' priorities and then their ability to solve some of their priorities and challenges. And they often build supportive networks. And then they're finally developing the capacity of peer support and lay health workers who are part of the communities themselves. So one of the challenges with these models is involving groups not typically included, such as women and elders. So it's really important to find ways to involve diverse stakeholders when you are doing community outreach and peer support. A few of you asked about the logistics of a peer support program and intervention, and Peggy and Mahad are going to talk about that, but you're also going to be receiving an article after this webinar that provides a detailed overview of the process of a peer support program. Okay, and then again, there are a few things that we don't know with this. So what are the experiences of peer supporters? These articles tend to focus on the outcomes within the community. What kind of professional development is most beneficial? And is there a point where professional development just makes people feel overwhelmed or overloaded? And what incentives are best used? Another word of caution is that I said I come from a public health background where we use a lot of community health workers to help implement programs. Really vital individuals, they often feel overwhelmed because they will say things like, you know, I tried to go grocery shopping with my family last night and saw people from my community, and they were just asking me about work and what services. So sometimes it feels like people don't have that time off and don't have that kind of balance between work and personal life. So it's important to help everyone establish boundaries if you're in a role where you're overseeing some of these programs. And then before I turn it over to Peggy and Mahad, do you have any questions so far?
Hi, Julie. We did get one question while you were presenting this last section.
Oh, yes.
Jordan asked, is there any data on incentives for group participants, such as honoring their time and energy in participating? We've noticed,
sorry. No.
Just the end was, we've noticed this increases trust and reciprocal respect for time and responsibilities.
It does. That's a really excellent question. So I have had different experiences with that when I was a practitioner versus as a researcher. So when I was a practitioner, we did not always have the money to offer incentives and just kind of hoped that it was something that people enjoyed doing or that they would come to naturally if they had time, but or maybe we would have incentives just for travel and transportation. But as a researcher, I do find that it's enhanced participation in programs. But I guess one of the challenges is, so I do think incentives are a really excellent idea, but a challenge with that would be the sustainability of such incentives. And as we know, a lot of this work relies on grant-funded projects. So making sure that you can always give those. And then if there's a different intervention or program, will people feel unhappy with that or resentful about those people who are delivering the program? So I do think it's an excellent idea, but there are a couple of things to take into consideration. And it does respect people's time. I agree with that.
Great, thank you. We did get one other question if we have time.
Of course.
Sure. So Camille said earlier we define resilience as negotiation of well-being. How do resettlement agencies give their clients the agency to negotiate the service or the ways it is provided when having so many constraints themselves?
Oh, wow, what a great question. Yes, and I do remember well working in resettlement, so I am not without sympathy for people trying to negotiate a really busy schedule and different roles. I think one of the ways is to really map out some community resources together with clients and maybe have people practice, and then also start to build coalitions that include trusted people like religious leaders and elders, so that all of the stress isn't on people working at resettlement agencies. And then it's, you're really also identifying people who are kind of naturally preferred supports within the communities. So getting people to, oh, sorry, I'm seeing another question. So I think I finished that one.
Okay, do we have time for this third one?
I think so, depending on
okay.
Yeah.
So this says from Summer, transportation has been our biggest challenge for our peer support groups. We want to grow the groups, but we have limited capacity for transportation. We have to recruit volunteers, confirm with clients if they are coming, and then text individual addresses to volunteers. It is a huge nightmare and causes work on nights and weekends. Are there any best practices for getting people to groups? If transportation is not provided, clients just don't show up.
Yeah, I think, so what the literature will say is transportation is the best practice, and figuring out a way to provide either reimbursement for transportation or to, when I worked on the Somali prenatal group that I talked about, we had babysitters and transportation, but again, it's a challenge of sustainability. So I think that, yeah, that so itself is the best practice, but unfortunately there's not a lot about kind of the logistics behind that, and I'm sorry, I know that doesn't help as much as I would like it to.
If I can chime in on that for a second, this is a easy bureaucratic answer that in practice is neither easy nor bureaucratic, but in its implementation. One of the things that we've been able to do here in Portland, hand in hand with certifying our peers as certified peer specialists, culturally specific, but still certified peer specialists, it means we have access to Medicaid billing, which opens up transportation options as far as medical transportation. So that tends to be really different depending on your situation and your context, as well as how easy to utilize the Medicaid systems are. I know in Philadelphia we didn't have that benefit as far as medical transportation for group activities nearly as well as it happens here. So it's an additional question to look into.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Really quickly before we move on, Kathleen did mention that one suggestion is maybe holding the groups in more accessible places like libraries or apartment common areas.
Thank you, and that is an excellent suggestion. So that is something that we are doing here in our research, and a lot of people have said, like, we'd like to hold this in churches or, so really asking people where they can get and what works for them. Thank you, Kathleen. That's a really fantastic suggestion. And I think that question is for Peggy, so maybe if they...
I can read Summer's question.
Okay.
Sure. So she said, where would I go to start this process? We do have a licensed psychologist facilitating our men's group, and I think we could use Medicaid billing for that.
And I think that's a Peggy question.
Yeah, it depends on what state as far as how each municipality has access to the medical transportation system. Pennsylvania was pretty limited to individual appointments, and we had a tremendous concerns with language access as far as sort of bridging that gap. My first question would be to whoever your coordinated care organization is dealing with Medicaid. That's not a thing that I know offhand, depending on where you are, but how to start utilizing medical transportation.
Summer, perhaps if you can send more information about your specific group to the Switchboard email address, we can connect you with Peggy to kind of follow up on that.
I will give it a shot.
Great. Back to you, Julie.
Okay, and then I think hopefully I've passed it on to Peggy successfully. So yep. I think Peggy and Mahad can take it away.
All right.
Yes. So here at Lutheran Community Services, we utilize what is known as culturally specific peer support specialists. Really, it has been a journey for us to get to that place of helping and creating culturally specific peer support specialists to work within our clinical setting. And just a little bit of background, peer support specialists have been used in the addiction and substance abuse world for the last 30 years, and they've become really more prevalent within the mental health community as the years have gone by. Really, peer support is essentially about shared mutual experience, but the way it's used in mainstream is the person who is a peer support specialist have had sort of a substance abuse issue or a mental health issue, or been a member of a family who did. But in our situation, we say that having had the lived experience of an immigrant and refugees, and having used the systems that refugees and immigrants have to use in navigating, that in itself qualifies you, and the trauma of being an immigrant and refugees and the resettlement and the adjustment process qualifies you to be a culturally specific peer support specialist or a peer support specialist in lieu of having had a mental health diagnosis. It really focuses on cultural adjustment. Our peer support specialists help with cultural adjustment. They provide case management services. They also do what is known as peer-led interventions, which is a little bit different than peer support than case management. It's also about helping people navigate resources and adjusting to new systems. And we do have our culturally specific peer support specialists do have a degree of training around mental health issues, but a lot of their training is integrating the mental health lens the Western perspective has, along with their cultural and community lens. And we're really fortunate in the state of Oregon to have a traditional health worker mechanism where peer support specialists are able to bill and work under.
So one of the things that we've been able to do here in Portland, like Mahad mentioned, is kind of bridge this gap in lack of services, but also between refugee-focused service providers and mainstream, and our work with the Oregon Health Authority to verify and validate that. So all of our peers are registered with the Oregon Health Authority. Because of the shortage of culturally appropriate kind of higher level mental health providers, they can do a lot of things under this credential. And along with that credential, they had the same kind of training as mainstream peer support specialists. They just have an additional focus, an additional emphasis on the refugee experience. And that's really the value. Their lived experience can really connect to our refugee clients in that shared experience as far as migration, difficulty in acculturation, sort of loss of status are some of the things that we see most often. They also help in reducing barriers to accessing care. And so we see this both within a mental health context, but also in any kind of service provider. Right? I can talk all day and all night as a nice white lady in my office, but our peers are really able to connect in the community in a way that makes sense, oftentimes in a language that makes sense, although not explicitly. We do have some of our peers that are working across culturally as well, and really kind of demystify what it means to ask for help and receive services in a Western context. Their ability to reduce stigma within communities is unmatched, in my opinion. We also draw upon the relationship that is sort of inherent in peer support to address and decrease health inequities and social determinants of health. Our peers are really community health workers in a lot of ways, community mental health workers, and they're the ones sort of bringing clients to us, saying, hey, I know this person in my community, and I really think that there's some additional kind of supports needed. And oftentimes, that's literally bringing them to us in the office, or bringing clinicians out into homes, community centers, mosques, churches, kind of to do the work where the work is happening. The biggest way that we kind of connect this idea to case management in our model of care here in Portland is case management is a task rather than a position. So I, as a clinician, can do case management. Mahad, as a peer, can do case management. And the way that we approach completing a task might be very different. Some ways it might be similar, overall it might be very different. What he can do as far as leveraging the relationship, empowerment, resilience from the cultural perspective, oftentimes serves our folks in a much broader way and much more culturally resonant way than I can as a clinician. And this is really what Stewart and Simich's work were touching on. It was a study, and I believe, Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, this is coming out in the info guide after our presentation today.
It will be coming out, thank you.
Kind of looking at and validating at the impact that peer counseling can have. And the biggest thing I want to keep sort of pointing to is relationship building. If we're able to build that relationship, maintain that relationship in a way that makes sense culturally, linguistically, spiritually, all of the lists of case management tasks that you folks in resettlement or other contexts have to do is only going to be easier. If we can come at those tasks from a relational perspective with empowerment in mind, that's only going to improve our ability to solve all of these problems that we all have and complete all these tasks that we know that we all have. And the peer support intervention within this study really gave refugee participants opportunities to meet new people, socialize with peers, share problems, receive different perspectives on potential solutions, recognize they're not the only ones facing challenges, and receive emotional support. I think one of the really beautiful aspects of peer support work in this context is it's reciprocal in some ways. It's about sharing, it's non-hierarchical, it's about expanding individual, community, and cultural networks for mutual support. So we spoke a little bit about our model already, and Mahad's going to tell you a little bit more specifically about how we are drawing on all of these principles.
So our peer support specialists work across a transdisciplinary model of care. We have clinicians in our team as well as peer support specialists and case managers, each bringing their own lenses to supporting a client. And peer support specialists are always focused on, in many ways, what the clients can do for themselves, because they've been in that spot themselves. So they provide peer-delivered services, which I've said earlier, I've termed it as a peer-led interventions. They go to individuals who they're working with in the community, connect them to services, oftentimes just sitting with them and being able to be with them. That's really one of the most powerful things that they can do. They provide strength-based case management, as Peggy referred to. Oftentimes it's the way peer support specialists do case management as opposed to the way case managers do case management. A lot of the time, case managers are really focused on deficits rather than strength, and peer support specialists have always, have been there themselves and know what it is like to be sort of in many ways thought as somebody with less than. Oftentimes, what peers do is co-learning, like instead of like just going to the Social Security office and just expecting the peer to sort of initiate that process and to help you walk through that process, you're actually engaged actively with the person that you're working with, orienting them around the services, sort of teaching them how they can come here. Oftentimes we utilize the peer support specialists in terms of the transportation, so going to the Social Security office together, getting to the bus, you meet me at the bus, you meet me at the Social Security office, but I want you to get there on your own. I'm not going to drive you there. So oftentimes it's really based on like what people can do for themselves. Another thing that peer support specialists are really good at is conducting mental health outreach and promotion. The ability to use their own lived experience with community members and say, like, I've gone through that challenge of having anxiety. I've gone through that challenge of having what is classified as an adjustment disorder, but I've came out on the other side. They're able to talk to their community members in a way more relatable than somebody from the mainstream service. And one of the ways that we do peer support mental health promotion is by having groups. Our group model is really based on sort of a non-billing. We're lucky enough in Oregon to have grants from the state health authority to be able to provide adjustment support groups for various community members. We've had a Somali group as well as an Arabic-speaking group. So this is another way our peers lead those groups and help facilitate those groups along with a community-based agency.
So again, to bring it back to Julie's list of strengths-based case management attributes as it sort of applies to our model utilizing peers, like Mahad said, doing with instead of doing for. His example with transportation, I think, speaks to that so perfectly, as well as just this idea that there isn't a hierarchy. I think a lot of our clinicians really sometimes struggle with this, and that, oh, you want me to do case management? Isn't that someone else's job? But really drawing on that shared relationship to build trust and also to connect to resources. Mutuality, mutual learning, popular learning and exchange, and that sort of reciprocal idea of, hey, this worked for me, like maybe we can try this together, or kind of what's worked for you in the past. I think Julie alluded to this question as well as far as strengths-based interview concepts. And really drilling down and focusing on this concept that every individual that we encounter is the expert in their own experience. And grad school didn't really teach me that. My social work program didn't really teach me that. Being with people teaches us that, as do all of these concepts around strengths-based case management and strengths-based interview skills. I think motivational interviewing is another way of getting to some of these individual expertise that Julie referenced as well. Seeing culture as a value. Culture is a strength. Cultural practices are a strength. Cultural approaches to wellness, and raising those and centering those along with any biomedical or clinical mental health approaches. Our transdisciplinary model really references this, that some of our clients are going to be better served by our peers, with the caveat that they receive weekly clinical supervision, that we have monthly peer support, sort of group supervision for our peers, as well as their 40 and 80-hour certification and ongoing professional development, so that we're really trusting in each other to identify and kind of level up when someone's level of distress becomes more significant, that they really need a trained clinicians in addition, and then using the relationship that the peers have built already to sort of facilitate whatever higher level of care that's needed.
The next thing we're going to talk about is an example of how peers work and how they connect clients to community. I worked with this client named Patrick. We changed where he was from to Central Africa, but really Patrick was dealing with a lot of isolation and tension within his family. Sort of one of the things that we did was just one day he came in really agitated, and so we thought, what can we do for Patrick at that time? What was his what were his strengths, and how can we connect him to his strengths? So we met with Patrick, and we asked him about, like, when were you the most happiest in your life? And Patrick said that he enjoyed being around people, he enjoyed having friendships, and so I knew of an African men's group, and so I reached out to that African men's group, and we met up together on a particular Saturday, and we went to that group, and what he found was he was able to find people who relate to him and to his experience, and so he was able to make a connection with the African Man Group's facilitator, and who really in no time helped him connect to a church, and in that process he was able to access a job opportunity. Really, it focuses on empowerment. We could have just said, okay, Patrick is really dealing with some kind of an emotional health issues, even though he's dealing with some kind of emotional health issue. What we focused was, how can we empower him, and what are the things that could help him in that format. I know we had this group, and so we were able to link him, and I know that he sort of enjoyed being around people. And so always finding what are sort of ways you can bring individuals to their strengths. We partner up another notion of strength-based is the notion that you don't do it alone, you do it within the community, and that you look for community organization, community groups to be able to sort of help you in sort of helping individuals realize their strengths.
Before we go on to our second case example, were there any questions so far as relating to using our peer model for case management, or this first example that we've given you?
Hi, Peggy. I don't see any questions so far. You can wait a
Okay.
couple minutes if you'd like. Okay.
Sure. I think we forgot to put a question slide in, so I just wanted to hear from folks if there's anything that came up. So
I think we can move on, and then if there's any that come up throughout the rest of the presentation, we can address them at the end.
Perfect. So our second example is a case I actually just inherited, and I've heard sort of both sides of this story from the client herself as well as the peer that was involved. And again, we've changed sort of identifying information as appropriate. So this is pretty general. But she had been prosecuted for shoplifting and was really, really, really mortified by this, completely sort of shut down and isolated. Through her court process, she was sentenced to community service, and apparently this, because of her sort of shutdown around this and the cultural shame and stigma, she was just refusing to kind of deal with this. And the peer support specialist that was working with her, trying to help sort of navigate all of these bureaucratic challenges in her process, was able to get her connected to a church-based food kitchen that was Coptic Christian. She was not Coptic Christian, but at least that made some kind of sense to her. And she really, in fulfilling that kind of requirement there, in addition to just sort of alleviating some of the legal stress, what really sort of started to come out was that she kind of liked it. She liked having a place to go. She liked having a role. She liked having people that acknowledged her and validated her and really needed her. She also, her English started getting a lot better, which we didn't really ever expect from that whole interaction. But being out in the community and being surrounded by people speaking English, she got a little bit more confident. She started speaking a little bit more. She started taking public transportation herself, which she'd never done. The way that she describes this is she just got much more gutsy and much more brave throughout this whole process. And actually, when I saw her for her session recently, she was saying that her supervisor loves her so much, and this is her words, loves me so much he wants to keep me, wants to try to hire her for a full-time position. And she's not sure what she wants to do with that, but just the way that her kind of affect and demeanor kind of shifts when she's talking about this with such pride was really wonderful to see. And so how this kind of exemplifies strengths-based case management here, strengths-based practices, kind of the way that she and the peer were able to work together within this need that they had to satisfy, right? They had the legal process that they had to satisfy, but to use that as an opportunity and a stepping stone to her future. So sort of tying that back to this empowerment feature in goal setting, in collaborative goal setting, as well as leveraging relationships with outside communities. So this worked out in such a meaningful way, in part because our peer had known of this soup kitchen. He had been involved with it there. I believe it's his spiritual home. He had a relationship that he was able to leverage to kind of get her a position with and have someone be mindful of how her needs as a refugee and not as a native English speaker would be a little bit different than anyone else, and sort of to kind of smooth that over, kind of ease the way for her. It was really, really exciting to see. Okay.
So we don't have any questions that it looks like have come through so far, but I'm happy to use some of the questions we got at the registration time if you'd like to answer those, Peggy.
Sure. I will field them as best as I can, and maybe pass on to when it makes sense.
Of course, yeah. So this one actually I think ties in nicely to what you were just speaking about. One of the questions we received was, how do you overcome the need for cultural privacy where clients feel they do not want others within their circle who could end up being support systems from knowing or being included in their struggles? Some cultures feel that displaying challenges is a no.
Yeah, I can speak to this shortly, and then I think Mahad might have a additional kind of pertinent perspective. One of the things, sort of from the clinician perspective, from the outset when we're doing intake, we have a lot of conversations about what this role is, both what a case manager is, as well as what a peer support specialist is, and kind of as part of our initial, almost like psychoeducation to our services, having confidentiality and privacy be a really dense part of that. I revisit this a lot with clients in our sessions as well, and I know it comes up in supervision very often. And I over and over, I'm going to defer to the client. If they're uncomfortable with this, we're not going to do it. We also, with these sort of cultural questions around privacy and confidentiality, and this kind of awareness that lots of cultures don't have the same beliefs and values around that like Americans do. We've made some kind of out of cultural community connections with peers on purpose to sort of ease some of their anxiety around that if that's something that they're comfortable with. So that does complicate the relationship a little bit. Often that'll require an interpreter in addition. That's something that we've tried on occasion. And I think it really requires just a lot of conversation, sort of initially as peers are building that relationship, as much as clinicians or other folks making those referrals, of like how this works and what the value could be. Mahad, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, asking for help is always hard, and trying to ask for help within from the members of your community is also harder because people have a tendency to gossip, and also it takes a little bit of reorienting. I think one of the things that peers can do is share their lived experience and share examples of like what it felt like to ask for help with somebody from somebody from their community. Saying that I had this challenge in my head. I thought they were going to tell somebody. I thought they were going to air my business to other people that I didn't want them to know. But in actual reality, this is what I found. But I know that that might not be the case for you. But I want you to know that if you are going to go that route of going to ask for people in your community to help you, I'm here to support you. So always opening up the door and being empathetic and realizing the challenge of doing that. And I know a lot of immigrants or refugees always want to feel like they are sort of super people in some ways, and asking for help can be challenging, but also understanding their need to feel that way and being empathetic and always keeping the door open and saying, I know you're feeling like this, and I know the challenges that you're sort of thinking about, they're legitimate, but also I want you to think about it. When you're ready to take a risk, I'm here to support you, and seeing ways you can go to people you can trust in the community who don't have that tendency to talk a lot and share people's private business or personal challenges with others would be another route to go.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahad and Peggy. We did get another question from Cassandra. She said, I am struggling with the doing with instead of doing for. I feel like my families often think I am shirking my duties instead of trying to have them do things on their own.
I love this question, and I'm so grateful to Cassandra for raising this. And I think on a basic level, it's a little bit of a paradigm shift for everyone involved, least of all our refugee families. and finding what little kind of corner in the task or in the need that can be mutual, that can be collaborative, and really kind of raising that success of like, okay, so I know we have all of this craziness that we need to do today, and you've just handed me this stack of letters that you don't understand and I'll need responsive to. While I'm doing that, what can you tackle? What makes sense? Like, what can we do together? What information or support do you need from me so that you can look at this first one thing, and then we can talk about it. I think that it involves us all slowing down, which is often improbable at best, particularly folks in resettlement that have that time clock that we're always conscious of. But it does take an extra second to think about, okay, how can I empower this person? How can I make this connection so that they can solve this in the future, even though it would take me, maybe half as long if I just did it for them instead of us doing this together. Anything you would add to that?
Yeah, it depends on the situation and the context. Sometimes I feel like you have to do it for. I mean, if a person is illiterate and cannot write or read, you have to be able to help them fill out that application.
Yeah.
But in the process of helping them fill out that application, you can almost in some ways give them a skill of like, okay, this is what we're doing. This is the reason why we're doing it. This is how it works. Sort of trusting them that they have the ability to be able to understand what you're doing. Always letting them into what you're doing with them. So that's another thing. And doing for, I think that's another thing that we struggle with in our sort of setting that we work with at Lutheran Community Services. A lot of the refugee clients come with a lot of different needs, and they feel like we can solve all these different needs that they have. But the reality is we can't. I think a lot of the things that we do as a peer support specialist is try to do with rather than doing for. So I earlier referenced the example of going to the Social Security office, expecting them to be able to ride the bus and to meet me at the Social Security office, even though they're not all that familiar with the bus service, but trusting that they can find their way there because we've done it together. We've actually taken the bus together to get to the Social Security office, but this time I'm going to trust you to do it on your own. So it's a process, and it's just a common thing, I think, that we all deal with in the social service sector, that people have this expectation that we can do things for them and that they can't oftentimes feel like they feel disempowered, but always reorienting and saying, you do have power, and doing it in a very subtle way, and sometimes you can be very overt and say, this is what I want you to do from the get-go. You want to be able to say to them, this is going to be a collaborative relationship. There are things that I expect you to do, and there are things that I can do with you. So laying that out and being sort of upfront in the beginning might be a lot more helpful.
Great. Thank you both so much. Do we want to move on to the next few slides? I also have other questions that we can go over as well.
I am happy with whatever works for others.
Okay. Well, we are getting a few more questions in the chat, so maybe I'll just keep going. So Theo has asked, I'm wondering if the toolkit and resources will come with some different case studies or academic articles on outcomes on the different models discussed in this webinar.
That is a great question. So I chose one that really provided some specific insight into how to put together a peer support intervention, but I am happy to send some different articles to people who are interested. So I guess, Rebecca, would I connect with people through you, or?
Yeah, if anyone has follow-up questions in general about the webinar or requests for additional resources, you can email Switchboard, and then we can connect you with any three of our presenters today to do some follow-up.
Yeah, and I have a stack of case studies, so I'm happy to send those, but didn't really want to overwhelm people. So thanks.
Sure. So
if I could make an additional comment to Theo, and to the rest of the audience, I think one of the things that we have really encountered in sort of building and expanding our model here, there's a lot of research and a lot of sort of toolkits around mainstream peer programs. And what we are doing here as far as culturally specific peer programs is a little bit unique and different. There have been some within indigenous communities that we've encountered, as well within Spanish-speaking kind of migrant populations. But like Julie spoke so eloquently to, the research base is pretty sparse.
Yes.
We do have a curriculum at Lutheran in terms of our training curriculum that focuses heavily on the refugee experience and the refugee lens in peer support work. So we're happy to share, but it's not in electronic form. It's in paper format, as we know. So I guess if you're willing to pay for the mailing, we're happy to send you one of our curriculum guides.
Okay, great. Are we ready for a few more questions?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. So some other ones we received from the registration was, what are some practical ways to weave strengths-based approaches into program development and design?
That's a really great question. So I can try to take a first stab at that, and then Peggy and Mahad, if you want to help me out, if you feel so inclined later. So I think, first of all, I really like Pula's 3 questions, which I think are a really good way to just integrate this into everyday practice and become kind of comfortable with how we're framing work with refugee clients and communities. Another practical way in terms of program development and design, I know that when I worked as a practitioner, we did a lot of needs assessments. I think a good fix for that is to kind of think about these as needs and strengths assessments, because if we're only looking at needs, we're both ignoring the strengths and then assuming that organizations and organization staff are the primary power holders or the holders of solutions. So this is a way to decenter institutions and really look at institutions as part of a really vast network that exists within the community. So in terms of measurements and what that might look like, it could be as simple as having focus groups and saying, you know, what are some of the priorities like that your community would like to address? How do you think you might be able to address this? What do you need? What resources exist for you to go about this? I would also think about community advisory boards from the get-go. So these are people who can help advise programs and really think about different stakeholders, and again, including those who are not typically represented. So bringing elders to the table, or women, if you're doing youth-focused programming, bringing youth to the table, but that can get challenging, I know. And then really considering like the vast community stakeholders and who should be receiving updates from programs and how you're disseminating knowledge. So I think that's my start to it. I don't know if Peggy and Mahad have anything to add to that.
I think, again, I have to go back to collaboration, and that goes down to whoever is doing program planning and evaluation, and kind of continuing to shift the narrative to strengths rather than deficits. It's not a satisfying answer, but I've seen it over and over again as far as starting new programs where it's about a lack rather than a value.
Yeah.
Okay. There is a question, from Kathleen. She's asking about compensation from the CSPSS program. Oh, sorry. So she's saying,
Yeah.
How are they paid? Are they regular staff or temporary?
Yeah, so at least here, and how we utilize peers at Lutheran in Portland, with their credential, then they can be employed in a mainstream mental health context, and they can bill for their services. So we have right now, oh my gosh, I should not blank on this number, 3?
Me, Hakimi, and Sam.
And
Daya is unofficially working for the Pathways program.
Yeah, we have about 3.5 full-time peers in our clinical program, as well as one part-time case manager who's waiting to take our peer support training. And so with their credential and their coverage by the Oregon Health Authority, which is, again, we know a bit different than in many other states, they are able to bill Medicaid, and we're able to be reimbursed for their care, for their services. One of the things that we've noticed in our peer support training, so we've done four peer support certification trainings, is we've trained a lot more people than there are positions, and that's one of our bigger challenges. I think to the follow-up questions as far as career path to another position, has been a bit contentious in some of our conversations, because we really want to value and maintain and empower kind of the skills that they bring through their lived experience, and not just assume that the way for them to develop is to become a clinician. We could do a whole other webinar on the care and keeping of peer staff, perhaps another time. And then as well, transitions to new communities. I think that's really a bigger question around funding. One of my next pushes is to expand the language access that we have, as well as gender. There's a different kind of access that female peer staff can have to female clients, as I'm sure many of you can speak to. But some of that comes back around to funding for additional positions.
Okay, great. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, so I think we can do one more question, and then we will wrap up the webinar. So the final question will be, how can we apply strengths-based services to creating social capital for clients?
I love that.
That's a really great question. And I'm excited about that, because I'm actually a social capital and resilience researcher. So the good thing about social capital with refugee communities is that we actually know that even perceived access to resources really helps people feel situated and comfortable in their environment. So individuals might be a few degrees of separation removed from a person who can provide resources or from the resources themselves. But as long as they know that people in their communities have access to those, they feel pretty comfortable. Like, okay, at least maybe I don't have direct access, but I can go to somebody who does. So I think that's incredibly important. And in terms of finding people who can bridge to other resources, I think some of the practical implications and tying it back to strengths-based services are to really work on building the capacity of community members. So either as peer support specialists, as working together with religious leaders, working with other elders and community leaders, helping to build some of their access to services is a good way to reach clients who might not typically have the same degree of access. So instead of assuming that, or instead of trying to get everyone that direct access, really working with the community as a whole and thinking about the networks that exist within that community. And I don't know, Peggy and Mahad, if you have like any kind of specific advice for this too.
I mean, when I work with refugees as well as mainstream folks, the way I describe what I do as a counselor is finding people who need people more people. I think the more connections you have, the more ability you have to utilize more connections. And whether that's within your community, whether that's outside of your community, kind of just expanding that ability to have your own needs be met, and to have the faith that you can meet your own needs and the needs of your family and your community.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both so much for your responses. So in the couple minutes we have left, I just wanted to let you know that you will be receiving an email after today's webinar that will list several resources related to the topic we've covered today. The first is an info guide that Julie helped to create that accompanies the webinar, and it's now available on the Switchboard Resource Library, and you'll be receiving a link to it. And the email will also have a few external resources that Julie mentioned earlier in the webinar, one of which is going to explain how to put together a peer support intervention, because we did receive a request for that. And lastly, you can also submit a technical assistance request to Switchboard on any topic, and we will also do our best to address your request and match you to an expert to fulfill it. Okay. Julie, would you like to review the learning objectives?
Sure. Okay, so today we covered being able to define key concepts related to strengths-based service delivery and resilience, recognizing individual, family, and community and cultural strengths and assets in the resettlement context, describing how a peer support model can promote resilience and well-being, which was our lovely case study by Peggy and Mahad, and then naming some evidence-informed strategies that can be used to build on the strengths of clients and communities in the U.S. resettlement context.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank
well,
you.
We are now at time, so thank you so much to Julie, Peggy, and Mahad for presenting to us today. I hope everyone found this to be useful. Here's some ways you can stay in touch with Switchboard. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have follow-up questions or requests for resources, please do send us an email, and also check out our website and our social media. So thank you again, and with that, I'm going to close out the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.